Finally, a Zelda game. Like Princess Peach Showtime earlier this year, this was so long overdue. I cannot believe that this game was not made a long time ago, especially considering she is the title character after all. Nevertheless, it's finally here, better late than never, and it's just as fun as you expect it to be. But before we get into the actual gameplay and how it plays, here's a little synopsis. It begins with what should have been the standard rescue Zelda from Ganon scenario, but things take a wild turn when Link vanishes into a mysterious rift known as the Still World. These rifts start popping up all over Hyrule, swallowing up not just random villagers, but the king and his top advisors too. Now Zelda finds herself framed by imposters for causing all the chaos and is thrown into the castle's dungeons. Things aren't looking great for her, until a little fairy named Tri busts her out and hands her the Tri Rod, a magical tool that lets her repair the rifts. So, it's up to Zelda to save Hyrule, fix the mess, and rescue everyone still trapped in the Still World, including Link. Just a word of warning though, I am going to be annoying about this, drawing a lot of parallels with this and Tears of the Kingdom, because in a lot of ways, they are quite similar, except for one key area that really separates it, and I think it's for the best. On the surface, you may be forgiven for thinking that what Echoes of Wisdom is to the Link's Awakening remake is essentially what Tears of the Kingdom is to Breath of the Wild. And it kind of is. At least in terms of the engine, the art style, and it being a 2D Zelda in what I assume is the hero is defeated timeline, and the sandbox elements where you can get really creative. But the key difference here is that after Tears of the Kingdom, I find it very difficult to go back to Breath of the Wild, as it builds on what was and acts as an innovation of it. Whereas I won't find it difficult to replay Link's Awakening if I wanted to, primarily because Link and Zelda play almost very differently. I say that as a sort of asterisk because you can still use Link's abilities to some degree. Like, you can still swing a sword, you can still use a shield, and you can still fire arrows.
And throw bombs.
However, that is only for a certain duration of time. You can't use it however often you feel like. It's only so long as you're in the sword fighter form and your energy meter drains, which can be replenished by defeating evil echoes or drinking potions or smoothies. But you can actually upgrade your weapons in your sword fighter form by collecting unusual crystals, or mighty crystals as they're called later, and taking them to Luberry's house. Using the staff given to her by Tri, Zelda is able to manipulate and mimic objects that are around her to help her through different situations. This is what is called an echo. She uses them to platform up to higher spaces, large gaps, and she can even echo defeated enemies to use against other enemies.
You thunder against me!
And it's really cool how creative you can be in how you choose to approach things. This is the aspect that may remind you of Tears of the Kingdom, because like in Tears of the Kingdom, you can create things and come up with a multitude of creative solutions. Now, despite being a graphic designer and a video editor, I'm not as creative as some people are when it comes to things like this. Like, especially in Tears of the Kingdom, I would always see people come up with the wildest contraptions in that game, but I pretty much just use the most basic solutions to get around it. My favorite echo is probably the bed echo. I just use that for pretty much everything, and it checks out that Zelda probably would too. I mean, can you blame her? She is, after all, just an Eevee girl in a wakey world. The bed echo is especially useful for stacking and reaching higher places, and it's useful for the frugal, like me, who hate using up their potions to heal. I simply echo a bed and wait for her hearts to refill. That's not to say that I don't use potions at all, but I usually use them sparingly and somewhat hesitantly, even during boss fights. I try to use as few as possible. But alongside the potions that can either grant health, energy, or both, you've also got the fairies trapped in the bottles you find scattered throughout the game that can help you through a tough bind, and now, smoothies.
Very good.
Smoothies can be made using ingredients also scattered throughout the game, sometimes found in chests too, that can do the same. Or even grant resistances to heat, lightning, or cold, depending on the smoothie recipes you came up with. Yep, it kinda took notes from Breath of the Wild here, but instead of cooking, it's asking a business grub to make it for you. Aside from the bed, I also just stack a bunch of trampolines on top of each other, or better yet, swimming up water blocks. But using the water blocks won't always do the trick, so the trusty bed and trampolines combination usually do come in handy. However, towards the late game, I did find myself using the water blocks a hell of a lot more often. Accessories in the equipment tab are items you can equip that boost particular stats, and it's super helpful to swap between them depending on the situation you're in. For example, if you're underwater, which you often will be, you can either equip Zora's Flippers that grant a speed boost, or Zora Scale that increases your breathing duration. Out of the two, however, in my experience, I preferred using the flippers over the scales. Both can be useful, but I found the speed boost to be especially helpful considering that there are a lot of areas with bubbles, refilling your dive time.
In the same tab, there's also clothing you can equip, but you're only given those outfits as you progress through the story or by completing some side quests. They mostly add nothing and are mostly cosmetic, apart from this one cat suit that somehow allows you to talk to cats.
Which reminds me, there are quite a surprising number of side quests and minigames in this fairly linear game, but most of them don't really reward you with much other than usually an ingredient. And sure, it can be useful, but don't expect much more than that.
However, visiting the Slumber Dojo Dream Training Challenges is something that I would say is absolutely worth doing,
as you're not only granted the opportunity to test your skill and practice your echo abilities in different situations, but after every few levels, you are actually granted some pretty decent rewards. I won't spoil exactly what those items are, but it's definitely much more worthwhile than trying to show a Gerudo lady a tumbleweed, or taking a grilled fish from a worried mother to her sleeping son. Still, most of these side quests are easy enough to do, so there isn't much of a complaint here. Just know that none of them will be super helpful in the long run, but I'm glad that there's just more to do here, even if it is just kind of busy work.
That includes filling up some stamp cards for some half-decent rewards from the stamp guy.
And I'm actually surprised at just how much has gone into this game and how big it feels when comparing it to the Link's Awakening remake. But because the map feels bigger and there's more to explore, it seems that they've acknowledged this by adding horses to ride as mounts as well. Ones that you can borrow from either Hyrule Ranch, or one to call your own that can be summoned by a Carrot Echo after completing the Impa's Gift side quest. But in all honesty, there are so many fast travel points scattered throughout the map, you'll rarely even use it, if at all. But like the side quests, it's just an optional thing thrown in. Personally though, I like exploring the fields on foot and spinning around like a helicopter to find rupees.
Helicopter, helicopter.
To conserve my sword fighter stance, I found myself relying heavily on combat echoes, and my go-to was the Dark Nut. By strategically placing a few Dark Nut echoes on either end of my enemies, I could easily overwhelm them without having to dip into my limited sword fighter energy. As I progressed through the game and unlocked higher level versions of the echoes, the level 3 Dark Nut became my primary tool for dealing with these tougher foes. He's pretty OP, and once I had access to him, I used him in most of these combat encounters. For enemies that are out of reach, like flying creatures, I would just usually send out about 4 Albatrolls. These flying echoes could peck at enemies from a distance, and they're especially useful in boss fights, not only just for dealing damage, but for creating distractions. I would send them out while I would sneak around to get close enough to switch to my sword fighter style and swing away until enough damage was dealt. Another echo I found myself using a lot was the Bombfish. These little explosive creatures were perfect for taking out breakable blocks or enemies from a safe distance. I love using them against the Deku Babas. Tossing a Bombfish in their path would cause them to swallow the bomb, taking them out immediately. You could also set a Dark Nut on them to nip them in the bud, or you could use Tri's Bind power to pull them until they break. While the boss battles in this game maintain the high standards set by previous entries, matching each region's unique theme and atmosphere, I found that the further I progressed, the more the dungeons and the encounters began to feel a little drawn out. In earlier parts of the game, the steady introduction of the new mechanics, the puzzles, and the enemies kept things fresh and exciting, and kept things from being overwhelming. However, towards the latter half, particularly as you approach the final dungeons, there's a noticeable shift where the game feels like it's stretching out the experience. The challenge remains, but it's easy to feel a loss of momentum, as if the game is asking you to keep pushing through just a little too long.
I think part of the reason I say this is because there are some puzzles in the particular dungeon or two that I felt didn't effectively communicate how it was supposed to work. If you know, you know. And while I got used to it after a while, it did make my eyes roll a bit.
That's not to say that these sections aren't fun. They absolutely are. I think the overall pacing would have benefited from being tighter in the final stretch. It's something that's likely noticeable if, like me, you tend to marathon through games. I would recommend taking the series in strides, playing through each dungeon with some breaks in between to prevent that sense of fatigue from setting in. Doing so will help maintain the joy of exploring each region and facing off its bosses without feeling like it's overstaying its welcome. And thankfully, the game doesn't completely outstay its welcome either. It ends right before it does, and actually has a pretty satisfying conclusion, or at least as satisfying as you can get from a smaller 2D Zelda game. Playing through this game made me realize how much I actually want more Zelda games, and that got me thinking as to how they would tackle it, because I don't think having the same basic premise where Zelda saves Link every time makes sense, since he's not usually well known until after his journey. And even then, they usually forget.
I've never met this man in my life.
So while talking to some friends on Discord, we came up with some ideas to have games that serve as sequels or prequels to previous entries in the timeline. For example, having a full game, or at least a DLC, that gives us the full picture as to what happens when Zelda gets sent through time in Tears of the Kingdom, or what happens after Zelda sends Link back through time in Ocarina of Time,
Or showing us Zelda's perspective as Sheik.
or just having smaller spin-off games with her front and center. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Link as much as everyone else, and I still think that he should continue being the face of this franchise, but it would be nice to shake things up a little, to keep things fresh, because most of the series have a similar structure that can get a little played out after a while. But I doubt that Nintendo would actually do something like this, because Nintendo does what Nintendo wants. And even if I would love to see an Ocarina of Time remake, or have A Link to the Past get the same remake treatment as Link's Awakening, Nintendo probably wouldn't do that either. But it's nice to throw out ideas even if they just land into the void. Usually when I'm talking about Nintendo games on this channel, I rarely talk about performance. This is mostly because unless it's something like Pokemon, it will generally run very smoothly. And why wouldn't it? These games on the graphical front don't match other games on the competing platforms. It's running on hardware from well over 10 years ago that doesn't even match the power level of the PS4, though the successor is rumored to. And if we're talking first party, Nintendo doesn't typically encourage a crunch culture like a lot of AAA publishers do, so they take their time to iron things out. However, if this wasn't showing before, this game will definitely start showing the Switch's age, because performance-wise, this game struggles quite a lot. It's pretty abysmal for a lot of people. In my experience, it's not so bad that I still can't enjoy the game, but there are quite some noticeable frame drops and lag at times. But from what I've seen, a lot of people have worse issues than even me. Of course, it could be specific units, and in your specific case, it might run perfectly smoothly, but I think it's important to be aware either way. Because a friend of mine says it runs very smoothly, but it also seems like a common sentiment to see this game also run very poorly. So it's just something to keep note of, especially if the performance diminishes over time. Of course, most things aren't built to last these days, they deteriorate very quickly now, but when I played Tears of the Kingdom last year, I can't recall a single frame drop, but testing it out a few weeks ago, it seemed like it dropped below 12 FPS. And so if my Switch that I've only had for about 3.5 years is already like this, I can't imagine what these games are like running on the launch models. But regardless of the performance, I still had a really fun time playing this. The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom not only delivers the Zelda game we've all been waiting for, but also manages to carve out its own identity while paying homage to the classics. It gives us a fresh perspective on Hyrule, one where Zelda finally takes the center stage. Sure, it may share some similarities with Tears of the Kingdom and Link's Awakening, but it's got enough charm, creativity, and depth to stand out on its own. And while the boss battles and dungeons may drag towards the end, you can't deny the game's ambition. It's not perfect, but if you are a fan of the series, or even if you're just curious about what it's like to step into Zelda's shoes, this one is definitely worth your time. And hey, who knows, maybe this is just the beginning of more Zelda games to come.
Anyway, that's my take on Echoes of Wisdom. Let me know what you think in the comments, or if you've played the game, what was your favorite Echo ability? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.